Hello everyone, today we talk about the origins of the Crusades, a topic that would require actually in order to phrase and to name like this, let's say, would require, let's say, a whole university class, I believe, because the Crusades are probably, for every historian, medievalist, let's say, one of the most complex and complicated topics, not just to narrate, but to frame, really, and to explain and to dimension. And it's really a task that really nobody can be up to, in the sense that it's such a widespread topic that nobody can be effectively finding a complex answer to a question like, why the Crusades happened, what were really the causes, etc. Of course, we can identify a group of reasons, but as always, especially for such long time ago, time that is relatively bad documented, let's say, everything gets way more difficult in terms of quantifying really all these factors and bringing them together and make a synthesis that is actually realistic. And it doesn't even make sense, in fact, to pose the question at the end of the day, because it's renowningly a topic that cannot be a question that cannot be answered in this way. But I believe that at least in this video we will try to at least talk about a perspective that this is important to observe how the Crusades really weren't really anything that came out of the blue completely, that had actually a very machinos put in motion, right? And that had also let's say a myth surrounding them that was produced since actually the very first, in the first centuries of after which the, since then when they began, and that were telling the story actually from as it happens actually everywhere at the time, from a heavily biased perspective. That here it's not a matter of Christians, Muslims, or has nothing to do with that. It's a medieval historiography that is obviously biased, just like most of historiography actually up to, very, historiography is always biased, but say that the levels we have reached today are definitely, acceptable. Just they're the best that we decided to accept as relative standards, and definitely the best we ever had, historically speaking. But when we look at these worlds and reading those sources, really always, all the time, the question we should answer is why were people writing what they saw the thing like, and from which aim they really they really wrote these things and narrated the story that way. And the very antipathetic modern mindset is things like these were just a bunch of crazies and weirdos that wrote weird things that were completely disconnected from reality because they were a bunch of fanatics or bigots or stuff like that. This is probably one of the most childish, naive, and superficial statement that can be done, not just for this specific age in history. I always encourage my audience to to be aware, at least, that they're absolutely, we are absolutely not as intelligent and capable of people that lived 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, right? We are more intelligent in some ways, but those guys really made something that, for us, in fact, it's so beyond, actually, that it's even difficult to understand us. And then the average approach to history is even lower than this. It's like, I pick, as always, the flag of my favorite team, I wave it, I shout, I tell history, I rape it in the way I want, I bend it to my own ideology. So, as probably you have already understood, if you're a regular follower, at least, is that on this channel there is no room nor for leftists, nor for outriders. Here we talk about serious history in a way that naturally I tend to just to oversimplify for obvious reasons, if anything, because I have this finite time at disposal and I'm still kind of introducing these topics more than actually explaining them. But simply because, I realize that out there, when you touch, especially a topic like the Crusades, everybody goes nuts, goes wild, gets triggered in a way or in another. And personally, I have a huge problems with the Crusades. First of all, I mean, not with Crusades historically speaking, but with this topic and how it's approached in popular culture. Because in a completely honest way, of all the popular representations, let's say, and introductions to this topic, etc., I've never found not even a single, let's say, opinion that wasn't, let's say, YouTube videos. That is plenty out there. There are good channels on the Crusades. There is one I don't actually remember. There is something like History of the Crusades. They made actually a very good amount of videos. They're actually pretty good. I haven't watched them really, so that's maybe a real Crusades history. Yeah, this is the channel if you're interested into it. But that they kind of do right things. But if you look around in general, what's the spectrum, and the usual approach to this stuff is just, a sort of ideological clash. A cultural clash, if you want. I mean, that's how the Crusades are really portrayed, right? It's basically Christian Europe versus Muslim, whatever, Near East, Middle East. This is also probably one of the most stupid interpretation ever you can give to the Crusades in the first place, and it's actually wrong. I mean, this is not a matter of opinion. This is not a matter of how you think it ideologically speaking. It's simply not true. It's absolutely misleading as a concept, but especially it's not. And already when I address the thing in these terms, I already know there is someone who's clicking on this video and say unsubscribing, disliking, because they think that essentially you're making the story of modern what is politically correct. I don't give a damn about that. I'm absolutely nothing like that. I don't believe political correctness exists in the first place as a concept, so I completely dismiss it. I make history point, then I can make my own mistakes as a historian, and I can even BS myself, but that's not my aim. I frankly don't give a damn about what people think I think about it. So I think I had always an early interest for, not really listening to people's opinions to find an answer into them, but really through them. Like, the more I know about what people think, the more I can figure out the answer on my own, and possibly even keeping it for myself, in a kind of a greedy perspective. Naturally, I came to create a Schwerpunkt in part exactly to open to this, to have instead a kind of a more positive and let's say socially friendly approach towards the rest of humanity, and discussing with you about these things. And I must say, I also never got particularly interested into the history of Crusades proper. There is something about them also, because objectively I know them not so well. I mean, I never deepened thoroughly the topic aside from what I studied at school, at university, and I've read a fair amount of stuff about the Crusades, yes, but it never quite got into the minutiae and the details. I made actually here on Schwerpunkt a whole playlist dedicated to Crusades, but it's mostly military history and not much about the Crusades themselves. So I wanted to be even more aggressive today while thinking about this video in the approach to the story, but I tried to calm myself down a little bit and to simply tell you these things introductively speaking, in order to make you understand that there is a dimension that I'm not saying you personally, but like 90% of the people who approach topics like the Crusades fall into, right? That it's all an ideology, that it's because of religion, that it's because of racism, that it's because of all the stuff that obviously reflect what are at least the most popular political concerns nowadays, or what they're portrayed to be actually, because this is also the sad part of the story many times, but that unavoidably have an impact on how people look at things and how things are discussed primarily, right? I think that one of the reasons why I created Schwerpunkt is exactly to express my opinion from a background that I know that is fundamentally not non-biased, and it's kind of a bet. Like, I don't want you to look upon me like saying, oh, this guy is so pure and neutral and objective. Well, of course I'm not. I'm faulty as anyone can be, but at least I can assure you that I don't lean nor from one side nor another. Here I don't make it a matter of being, I don't care about what the theistic perspective is, I don't care what the atheistic perspective is, I don't care. When I'm a historian, I'm looking at the story, and I'm not telling you that to make you, to fuel some kind of tribalistic, perspective, emotions fundamentally, because that's what at the end of the day. And people assume that, I don't know what it's that they have to instrumentalize history in their very ignorant, limited, and narrow understanding of it, which is approximately zero most of the times, just to prove the fact, I don't know, that they're smarter, they're somehow have an opinion, or that they need to use this to wield this like a weapon against, in ideological fights and all this stuff. I think that history has this such huge amount of difficulty in order to understand in the first place that it's pretty easy to spot someone who doesn't know history, because when they get on those tracks, you already know that they haven't gone, far beyond the surface, right? Essentially, they don't know what they're talking about. And today's video is effectively not even about the Crusades proper. I mean, here I've chosen a bunch of pictures to keep you glued on the screen to compensate with the boredom provided by my voice and pretty rusty English. But let's say that today I would like to frame the origins propers of the Crusade, or at least to present a perspective that is not really much discussed about what was the humus, what was essentially the what was already launched before the Crusade proper, that effectively the Crusades are continuation of, right? So not to think that one day Christian Europe woke up and said, okay, actually Western Christian Europe, with partly of course in cooperation with the Eastern one, but we will see now that also that perspective is probably to be a bit redimensioned, at least considering the average narrative that is given about the requests of the Byzantine Empire, etc., in relation cause-effect in anything, and in the importance of this factor as a triggering factor, in fact. But to observe that the Crusades were effectively nothing that happened suddenly, nor that it had let's say that hadn't had inadequate preparation and a mental setting, right, of the Europeans, and partly the topic of the general, and that's also what I sadly realize, is that there is a dramatic flattened perception of the Middle Ages, as if the Crusades belonged to a sort of standard mode of Western Christianity that is inherent into this thing we call Middle Ages, and that they were all about essentially, obeying to this preset thing that they quite mechanically developed and went on with without even understanding why it is. There is a historiographically speaking, as you know, even a very deep criticism of the Crusades proper. There are very some very, very prominent historian of the Crusades said the only thing that effectively Europe got of the Crusades were apricots, right? That's pretty reductive. Actually, Crusades were a very important defining moment in Western civilization, in European identity, let's say, or at least in European, even not just identity, but really in understanding of the world, and realizing what was out there, what this could mean for them, and it's actually dramatically complicated even to properly look at this, like saying, what happened during the Crusades is essentially a Europe that passes from just a rural, largely feudal rural environment with very low incomes, etc., to Europe of sort of pre-modern Europe, at least in southwestern Europe, with sort of very intensely urbanized, demographically explosive and extremely wealthy and financially developed system that it's really changing the mind. Part of this passed through the Crusades, or at least through certain activities that were strongly tied to the Crusades themselves. And it's very reductive that to conceive that Crusades in fact were just this kind of colonialistic adventure of the Western Europeans in this time in history. Actually, that's also pretty lame and pretty ill conceived idea. Forget when you interpret the Crusades to think it was colonialism, to think that it was because definitions here are important. People actually do not know what colonialism is in the first place in terms of political, social, economical development. They weren't that thing. Medieval society couldn't be like that. It's not colonialism. And at the same time, and this was equally important, and if not more, absolutely erase from your mind that Crusades were wars of religion. These were not wars of religion, right? First of all, every kind of war at the time had this religious background mandate. It was partly how wars were justified. Everything at the time was in the name of God. Literally everything. So this doesn't make the Crusades any different from any kind of war out there. They weren't wars of religions because they weren't aimed to convert anyone. Of course, the Crusaders converted in parts certain groups, communities, etc. But even in there, the political dialectics is definitely way more extremely complicated. There were a huge amount of Muslims fighting for the Christians against Muslims, as well as there were a huge amount of Christians fighting for the Muslims against Christians, right? And this is widely known to anyone who at least know what the Crusades are. I even made a video recently that talking about Byzantines and Franks in the Seljuk armies well after even the start of the Crusades, and you understand that we're Christians going towards the Crusades that were hired actually by Muslim, not absolutely as slaves. This is interesting enough, so that they did it kind of more or less freely in certain contexts, and the same happened, as we were saying, for the Muslims. And there are also many other misconceptions, including the brutality of these fights. I don't know if you have ever read any source from actually 11, 12 century Europe or Near East, or whatever culture was involved, at least in Crusades properly, and knowing about the degree of violence that existed literally everywhere at the time, and comparing it to the one of the Crusades. I'm not saying that there wasn't a component of extra violence that derived naturally from religious hatred and rivalry, etc. But these are very extremely complicated and multi-variable systems into which, if you count what religious clash, let's say, added to the system in terms of violence and dynamics, it's virtually non-influent, right? These were radically violent worlds by definition everywhere in the world, right? The myth of the good savage is probably also one of the most idiotic things people ever came up with. It was normal. Let's say it was not normal to be violent, absolutely, because also if you look at the Christian world and this Muslim world at the time, violence is regulated. It's part of every state. It's part of every culture. You can't go out there killing literally everyone without discrimination. You have to consider this as a political and social dialectics first. Crusader states were fighting against each other and allying themselves with the Muslims literally all the time, as much as the Muslims did with the Christians. So looking at the story and pretending it was the clash of civilizations, that is this term that we have to come up with to evoke who knows which nightmare in the 20th century, 21st century, it's I can't. I ended the list of insults. Also, I don't want to get more picturesque with my lexicon, but let's say that there are great big problems in our society, right? And I'm not saying that I'm not a moral relativist. I think that Western world definitely has an edge and understands the Crusades better than, let's say, any other civilization that exists out here still, historiographically speaking. That is, that we are the ones who progress the most and have a more objective reason, but the standard average of the Western population absolutely doesn't understand the Crusades, and it's not actually their fault, because most people do not have nor the time, nor the opportunity, nor the will, maybe, to know about the Crusades, and this partly rests also on the shoulders as a guilt to those people who would teach them in extremely simplistic, idiotic ways. There are certain teachers and professors I've met in my life. They're just a bunch of idiots that did not know absolutely what they were talking about, and it's plenty of incompetent people all over. But there is a bigger problem at the end of the day, so that I actually come on individual responsibility more, that is this vice to actually talk about things that you do not know. Right, that is something that everybody do. Like, it's normal. It's part of our cognitive, it's the construction, our knowledge, our experience. But we should at least be aware that history is a serious thing. I mean, you can't come at one place and say, according to me, history was like this because I feel like it was that. You can't, fortunately, until today, at least, I hope, at least in certain contexts, take a degree in medieval history if you reason like that, especially towards the Crusades, if you hone these misconceptions. And just for saying that this is real, right? It's not me saying it. I'm just a deliverer, just a disclosure, let's say. It doesn't depend on me. I'm just telling you the way it is, and like I'm just giving you an advice, very, without any interest personally. If anything, to, maybe yes, to have more thinking people around and to be more aware of these problems, because normally many people do not have, and you can't exclusively blame them for not knowing that. We are all ignorant in some way, right? There is nothing about it. I know fairly nothing about engineering. Yeah, I say it, but in this sense I try to avoid, at least to pretend I know something about it, and it's not a problem for me to say I don't know anything about it, so it's perfectly fine. As long as we all agree on these standards that, there is a sort of authority that should stem from at least the knowledge of the sources, their interpretation. In this sense, doesn't mean you have to believe, in fact, as I was saying before, what others tell you, like if there are professors or particularly influent people, but let's say that tendentially you can find more there, generally, at least still in the society we have built up to now, in spite of the force now that are done to tear apart our hierarchies, etc. But there is this orientation. Our systems, educational systems, work in a way that you should at least tend towards what they show you, if it's valuable evidence at least. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So, starting to talk about this after this very long premise, but I think it was necessary for many reasons that now I hope you understand from my side as well, because you have to make this little effort to also understand what I have in mind, because I realize it's difficult to address these topics without approximations, but we have a limited time, and I'm already get enough criticized because of the length of my videos, and I realize, but well, yeah, let's say important things and try to concentrate them. So, starting by this 11th century Europe, right? Between the 10th and the 11th century, there are huge transformations in Europe. We discussed them. If you go to medieval society playlists, you can find everything like that. But for now, let's leave them aside. But let's say a great part of this transformation also came into what was the religious renewal. Let's say that saw in part the increasing spread of the practice of pilgrimage. Right. I made a video on the Crusades. It's called Armed Pilgrimage, in which I define this. So if you're interested into that, you can go look at that. And the pilgrimage is very important in here. Pilgrimage to us is just go make some trekking every once in a while. At the time, pilgrimage was something very important from a truly existential point of view. Some, of course, some just as today. I mean, I'm not saying today's pilgrims are, but today's people are usually heavily secularized and modernized. So what I'm telling is that we cannot really claim to feel the same exact things that a 10th or 11th century pilgrim really felt within himself, right? This was a world that didn't know physics, that didn't know, that looked at nature like a great mysterious symbols, that believed even mixed with all these superstitions. It was a world that came actually pretty freshly out of a pagan context. It was also pretty largely still rooted in part. Christianity had in part comforted, in part substituted itself to these beliefs, but everything was still very, very hybrid, very permeated by this magic view of the world. And that however, was probably a much more intense life experience than we can imagine, right? Even at this point we are desensitized in many ways, even to things like staying outdoors and feeling and living in the nature and living these cycles and looking at the world and thinking of it with curiosity. This is what I always remember about the medieval world, that there is no man in the history of mankind who was so inexhaustibly thirsty of knowledge like the medieval man. Erase from your mind that knowledge is something we start to appreciate later. Knowledge is appreciated exactly when you don't have it, and when you understand its meaning, and especially when you cover it with this divine symbolism that is effectively, the creation is something that God has created in order for mankind to decipher it, and therefore there is a moral duty that goes beyond our normal curiosity as modern people, that makes this medievals looking at the world and thinking and wondering what it could be. And 10th and 11th century Europe are a world that, however, is changing. It's changing not so dramatically fast, but let's say fast enough to change really much even of the real lifestyle of these people. Pilgrimage was nothing really new. It was something that existed arguably since the ancient world. It predates Christianity. Even obviously there was pilgrimage mixed even with this political and social ideals in pagan world, etc. And naturally the great points of of arrival, let's say the great yards, metas, let's say, were Rome and Jerusalem, for ultra obvious reasons. And these were definitely the most important cities of Christianity. From a strictly European perspective, objectively, Rome was probably felt and appreciated more than Jerusalem, right? It happens, I was reading, I think it was a 13th century Icelandic report about pilgrimage to Jerusalem passing through Rome, and what strikes you is that this Icelander guy arriving in Rome says, wow, this city is freaking amazing. It has full of churches, of ruins, of enormous palaces, etc. He remains literally in ecstasy in front of this. He goes then on to Jerusalem and says, okay, well, yeah, it's a beautiful place, it's sacred, but it kind of writes much less. So Rome was also this enormous, and this naturally is reflected by the development of the papacy, the first crusade is partly a consequence even of the Gregorian reforms. This directional role that the Church of Rome has acquired from the height of its spiritual authority, and the reverence that was met all over Europe. Like Rome was a real thing. Sometimes I get disappointed seeing how there is this strict division, as if people believe that the differences between the north and the south of Europe were something already then that people didn't care about. Rome was really the horizon of all Western Christian Europeans, at least Christian Western Europeans. It was a name still echoed for its importance, and everybody wanted to go to Rome. You find this people coming literally from everywhere, right? Rome had this flourishing foreign communities from all over Europe, and not only, by the way. And there is also this perspective that, in fact, today we are trying to define a little better about that is often repeated in a sort of cliche-like fashion. That is that medieval Europe was sort of half asleep at this time, and people didn't know about the rest. It's completely false. People traveled an awful lot. Not the average person, of course, but there were lots of people who traveled and they interacted with each other. This idea of the closed system of the Dark Middle Ages and feudal Europe as closed is probably, I believe, truly most stupid ideas, right, that you can ever formulate. And especially this comes from concentrating history, especially in certain local contexts. If you take cities like Rome or other centers of the Mediterranean, these were worlds that were in continuous contact since ever with the rest of the Mediterranean, for example, as well as the rest of Central Europe. They were connected. Rome was still the great cultural, spiritual capital of the Old West. You can say that throughout the early Middle Ages, basically all the great cultural developments of Western Europe passed through Rome in every single country. It's difficult to dimension this if you've never thought about it, if nobody told you, because I'm pretty aware that these things are not really said that much. There are certain contexts, at least, in which this is not appreciated to be recalled, right? Do not stop, never stop, especially for the Middle Ages, but in general for more, never stop to the idea that this was a closed world, that you can interpret the Middle Ages just thinking it was about the little tiny lordship isolated from the rest of the world. It doesn't work. It doesn't work on the base of basically literally everything we know about the Middle Ages. And it's harmful because it fuels part of those prejudices and stereotypes. So the big event naturally had been in the early Middle Ages, arguably, definitely the Islamic invasions, right? And this was really for many contexts, and especially in the Mediterranean, it was a traumatic moment. Like, most of Europe wasn't actually touched by Islamic invasions, but definitely certain regions, as you can imagine, Spain, where in fact the Reconquista starts pretty earlier, and that's where you can still see the Crusade formulating in part before the canonic First Crusade, as at least it was formulated at the time. Certain regions of Italy, but think even about the Byzantine Empire that with the Islamic invasions had seen not just the Arabs at their gates and repelling them under the city walls, but losing like half of the empire, literally, and think about what this meant in the perspective of the Roman Empire, that is the Christian Roman Empire, that is not an empire, is the universal empire that is also regarded as such by every single people that lived in Europe at the time, even if they weren't under that empire. We have to force ourselves to go beyond the boundaries, let's say, that we have fixed in our mind, like here starts this thing and here ends this other on the map. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that, and not even in the Muslim world, as a matter of fact. You can't conceive the Muslim world also in this extreme dramatic escalation. The Islamic Empire is something that basically explodes at the beginning. It has this enormous advantage for reasons that also are, in this sense, less dramatic than are usually believed, in the sense that the local populations actually supported heavily the Muslim advance. But in general, you see that Jerusalem, for example, that is lost to the Muslims since the 7th century, is still a place of pilgrimage, a destination of pilgrimage for Christians all over the world. There are Christians living there. Muslim government, for example, is fairly, let's say, arguably, let's say, fairly more tolerant than the Byzantine one. Part of the reason why all these populations of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt actually preferred to be under a Muslim ruler, still remaining Christians themselves, than under the heavy fiscalism of the Byzantine Empire. There is nothing strange about this. Throughout all history, basically, you look even at the Ottoman Empire, it was full of Christian Europeans or Jews that went living into the Ottoman Empire because by certain standards that they found employment, they were appreciated. So, and this means that there was always conflict. But there are certain people who can't reason more complexly than saying, okay, from one side there were these guys, from one side there were this other. They need to think that it was this inherent, tormented clash that basically deleted every kind of interaction. While you should be looking at these systems, especially also when they were fighting against each other, as extremely hybridized and intersectional systems. You can't understand the Reconquista if you think that literally there was a line from which, when one side there were the Christians and the other side there were the Muslims. And these were radically violent clashes. And this is what we have to be forced to understand. Because if you don't understand this simple concept, literally 95% of the people do, you can't understand not just the Crusades in this case, you can't understand history. I mean, it's over, at least. I don't believe it's over. I think no man is beyond redemption, but there is something seriously wrong, at least in that kind of conception, and you have to work pretty seriously on it, because this has nothing to do with political correctness or incorrectness. This has to do with basic intelligence that you're presented. Well, cognitive dissonance apparently is a thing, but more than that, you should wonder why you have certain preconceptions that you so strongly support at that point, because otherwise, and I repeat, this was radically violent and bloody and murderous and criminal warfare from both sides at the same time, right? Also, many people say, well, it was actually the Muslims who began it in the first place. Well, in a broader historical perspective, sure, I agree with this. I mean, I find pretty stupid when there are those people who accuse Europeans of having been colonialists, that in the name of God came to rape and murder, innocent Muslims who were there doing nothing. Of course, Muslims had arrived up to Aquitaine from one side. They had arrived under the gates of Constantinople from that side. But what I'm saying here is you can't interpret the Crusades as wall against wall between these two systems. And even if you look at where the Crusades were actually fought, you realize that they were pretty diverse systems, right? That they were partly always connected, right? But if you take Spain for example, the Iberian Peninsula, or even the Baltic Crusades, there's also a very fascinating theater. Aside from just the Near East, there's most famous, of course, but there were certain local logics, let's say, that were quite different from the rest, right? It's like before, by the way, I was telling you that this was not an entire block, right? There were many there are actually striking similarities between the Christian world and the Muslim world at this time, especially towards the 11th century, where basically the balance between the two powers is fundamentally even, right? And these societies actually resemble each other really a lot, especially also in terms of fragmentation. Now we'll see that political fragmentation. We'll see it better when talking about the Seljuk Turks and the impact that they had into this. Never think at monoliths. There was no monolith in this sense. And interestingly enough, although there was a relatively obvious difference between the Christian-dominated area and the Muslim-dominated area, still what really mattered, this has sense if you put religion at the center of the equation and think it was literally the most important thing, the decisive factor. Religion was just one determining factor, surely not the decisive one, probably not even one of the most important in the equation. As always, it's politics. First of all, with no negative or positive exception, just the real thing that politics is, right? And believe me, if you have been following Schwerpunkt, you already know what I'm talking about in the various contexts that we have precisely seen, but in the Crusades, at least this gets a bit more evident and easier, say, to picture, at least in the essentials. Now, coming back on pilgrimage and the idea of what it was, pilgrimage was just more than a physical, just a travel, right? It was a spiritual journey, first of all, and spiritual journeys were all over the place, literally. I mean, pilgrimage hadn't, in this sense, any say it was obviously was related to obviously the effort, the difficulties. Definitely moving across Europe wasn't extremely easy, especially at the beginning, etc. But as I said before, people traveled, and they traveled a lot. But the most important thing I'm saying here is that the spiritual element was the prevalent one. You could have a spiritual journey, even staying the place you were. That's the reason why monks lived the way they did. Why there was monks also traveled, actually. And actually, if you look at the Crusades, there were warrior monks even. So the thing is very, very shaded, and it should be understood not from the external shades that we tend to say the external patterns that we try to give it, but really trying to make this desperate effort at the end of the day to try to reason for what was most important to them. Salvation was a real thing, even if it was kind of very sometimes misunderstood or even simplistically approached, but the people truly believed in it, as well as they believed in many other things actually that played into it. So who were pilgrims usually that put themselves on the path towards the holy places, etc.? Well, there is also here no standard person. They were the most most diverse. They came from the most diverse social extractions. They had obviously this common motive, apparently at least the official one, that however beyond which we have to see much else. Obviously, economy. Need for the merchants traveled, and it was nothing strange for a merchant to visit holy places once they was there. There was nothing strange. You shouldn't have this preconceptions like the merchant was just a fat greedy guy who wanted to make money and had to make the thing an excuse to go there just to make money. No, we have to think they were genuinely driven even to do the same thing. Why not? This after all existed also in the Muslim world, as you know. It was normal. It was part of those times' lives. And the first, however, the first desire was to expiate your own guilts, right? So to fulfill a vow, to let's say ask, for example, so for I don't know, a healing or from an illness for yourself or for a relative. This form of moral piety that was definitely very important in everyday life at the time, etc. And the pilgrimage implied naturally in itself also this sound spirit of adventure, because as we were saying before, it was very difficult sometimes. I mean, when you reaching very far away places was really an adventure, was really an enterprise, and this meant that people had to stay away from home even for years, and yet people did it. Now think of the driving factor into this, like thinking for the misery, what would for our standards of life, definitely the misery of the life of the time really was what it meant to start this enterprise. I mean, to go there, to decide to make something of it, and to make this decision, and to really stay away all that time. And you don't have any phone, you don't have any, you have to take it as the great journey of your life that can even bring to death, because it happened. People were, along the road, they were full of brigands, thieves, etc. It wasn't easy, right? It was something which people were likely to die. I mean, many times, usually this happened at the end of someone's life, that if the strengths were still supporting you, because the ideal was to die, for example, there. Many people came to, many noblemen even came, I don't know, from Anglo-Saxon had England to die in Rome by standard, right? They made their own testament They arrived in Rome and they died. At least this is the the story of the majority of them, because it was really felt as an investment for afterlife, for for your own name, for your family, for this halo of sanctity that could not really of sanctity. Well, of course, there were saints that were proclaiming even in this context, but let's say of inspiration, even that could help others to really look beyond the miseries of this world. And this was an extremely miserable world. You can't really understand why those people did such things if you don't understand the sufferance that was inherent to that existence. I mean, existence is always painful and dramatic in itself, but hey, there is no comparison the way we live now. The people lived at the time, right? And up to 100 years ago. I mean, poor people today are some disgustingly wealthy for 100 years ago standards, and yet they complain freaking much, or at least there's an ideologism behind this that is fueling this dramatic historical misinterpretations. So that's why we have so many difficulties to frame this period and to look at it, and to really try to make an effort to understand it, because we don't even realize that there is an effort we have to make. We just take the passively the notion that it was a kind of backwards world, but you don't stay there and reflect what it meant to die just for a cold or for a little for an infection or something. That was really hard. People lived not extremely much, at least the mortality rate was much higher. Think about what it means to live in a world where you see so many people die, so many young people die. So on a regular base, people you loved, people you knew, it's really hard, it's really tough. So human mind, it's pretty amazing, pretty awesome, although we tend to make a poor use of it. But you can't really figure what really these people felt within themselves for choosing this path. And we know that there are, aside from a geography that naturally always, and especially for these times, always gives us a kind of a idealized and let's say idealized picture of what this episodes, etc. But there was a widespread participation to these activities and to these ways of life, really. And think of all the people who joined the clergy, the idea with all the limits to these ideals, naturally, and that we definitely know about. But it's something you can, I don't know, I realize it's kind of stupid to say, but just think of when you decide to make a travel, right? Even if it's something so simple for you to go on vacations abroad, to take a plane, but there is always that fascination, that kind of poetic understanding of life, this kind of Jungian idea of not much of a heroization, but the idea that there is much of unexplained that you need in your life, even not as a fully rational understanding of your moral, priorities and principles, but just being drawn towards that destination. It's very important. It's very important to understand the pilgrimage. It's very important to understand the crusade, because the crusade is nothing but an armed pilgrimage, and this is also particularly important to understand. The first time I think the first thing you associate the crusades is like a sword cutting someone's and blood of blood. That's how we have criminalized in our minds the Crusades. And surely the Crusades were an extremely violent affair. Like, life was extremely violent on average at the time. But the closest thing we can say to let's say we can get in order to understand how they saw it, the Crusade, that is a term that, by the way, appears much later, before the beginning of the Crusades proper, is a pilgrimage. We're talking about pilgrimages. And you can't make the joke, oh, well, it was, a pilgrimage, conquering other people's lands. It was a pilgrimage. It was a pilgrimage. Yes, going to conquer, going to slaughter, to fight, whatever. But it still was a pilgrimage. And this totalizing experience was all one with all the spiritual, political, social, and whatever tensions that permeated this world. It was a pretty tense world. It was a pretty agitated world. It was a pretty tormented world in many, many ways. So what I'm trying to say in here is that before the Crusades started, the canonic, let's say, Crusades started, there was already a mindset out there in the European world, in the Christian world, but not just in that one, that conceived the idea of the travel as this great, as first of all, it considered it in the first place, like it rendered a normal and feasible, even in its extraordinarity, but it was not something foreign or strange, right? The idea of really abandoning everything and going there somewhere because God guided you, right? And everything happens because of God's will. It's a very important idea, and therefore this world that at the same time was physically putting itself in motion for real. Like we'll say it perhaps better later, but this world was starting even within the same Europe to move, like entire communities shifting. Settlement, migrating to another place, being resettled, under the guidance, by the way, of the elites, of the feudal elites, of the ecclesiastical elites, and to build, to expand the Christian world proper, right? This is how certain things began. You can't, there are many examples, at least, of this that began much earlier than the Crusades. Think about, I don't know, the Frankish colonization of Saxony after Charlemagne's conquests. That was the idea that there was a sort of social engineering entailed in processes. Has to do even with very material reasons, very strictly socio-economical reasons of great reorganization, etc. But the important is at a spiritual level, at an ideal level, there was the awareness, the consciousness that you could make a choice, that you could make a change, right? That you could adapt to a new situation. You could take and this is also something we distantiated a lot from, because to us, okay, it's nothing strange to change home, etc. But let's say all we search is like a place where to stay fine, cozy, and kind of alienated from the rest. People moved at the time. There were, say, entire peasant families that didn't have to eat anymore. They had to find somewhere else to work for making a living in there. It was a dramatic thing. It was a big effort. It entailed a whole communitary perspective in the process. And this left a mark, because it kind of adds even to this transitory, the idea that the world is transitory, that this world really doesn't belong to us, right? That we shall pass on this world, and that there is something more important beyond that we shouldn't be concerned of. This is very important to understand the Crusades, and it's deeply rooted into Christian Europe at this time. It exists, and especially in Western Europe, I would say, because say the Byzantine Empire, certain other areas are not equally dynamic the same way, like southwestern Europe, probably speaking, or Western Europe, including England, or let's say having, but there is a world that is kind of transforming itself from the within, right? It's also a matter of self-portrait in some measures. Europeans start to think of what they should be and what their changes should be and where their energies should be channeled in. This is something that goes far beyond the Crusades. It's really the construction of a civil political order. When we talk about this, you don't have to think that literally everybody felt the same way, but because we don't know, for example, what the peasantry thought. We have absolutely no idea what an 11th century peasant could think about this stuff. We can't kind of guess it, can't kind of imagine certain things, but let's say this is also important. Most of the times we'll read the perspective of the elites. But this is also a moment in which the middle classes start to appear in some more dynamic way. And from those we see that there is a radical, brutal, and violent dynamism. These are freaking aggressive-minded people who are able to seize every kind of opportunity, economically speaking. They're extremely entrepreneurial. They take the sea, they go fighting the Saracens on their own. They're already used to this. Where do you think the Christians had begun to fight the Muslims from? This had began, especially in the Mediterranean, like ever since the Muslims had appeared. I mean, countries like Spain, like Italy, like Greece had always been in there, like with their mind. They had, because they had it from the other side. The Mediterranean is this great highway, let's say, where things happen pretty fast. In Gaul, of course, at this time, by the way, the beginning of the 11th century, there were still large areas of Muslim-held territory, even countries like, think about southern France, think about Sicily, think about, obviously Spain is the most famous thing. So there were also this immediate threats, apparently, but at the same time, the situation had partly frozen, or at least the Islamic world was heading towards a sort of crisis. Right, the Muslim world up to the previous centuries had been definitely the wealthiest one, the most culturally advanced, the more dynamic, in many ways, politically, socially, economically. Between the 10th and 11th century, and I believe in here we dramatically underestimate the European system, especially at this beginning. Europe is extremely effervescent. Right? There is something that is rising, and it rises from the bottom. It's not just it's guided by the elites. It's partly directed from the above, but it's something that really permeates the very very fabric of European, of this great Latin-Germanic world that is kind of to explode, and even if you look at the trade balance, etc., Europe surpasses the Islamic world very, very, very fast, and the Crusades have partly to do with this. Not much because, as you know, at the end of the day, it was a Christian failure because they lost everything there, but the trade balance, for example, by the 13th century is in the hand of the Europeans. Europe is a way wealthier, more dynamic and sophisticated system, and it develops and keeps developing, and is able to resist this dramatic thunderstorms that hit them, pretty bloodily at the roots of their own civilization. Take Black Death, take this and that resists. So we discussed this. There is a video made. It's something like the resilience of medieval civilization that takes this perspective into account. I think it's very important, and I think we underestimate this because in terms of timeline, because we tend to think the 10th and the 11th century as a moment of where everything was still very primitive in many ways, right? And that the growth restarted, the revival restarted from then. Instead, the thing had already happened before. I mean, already the 10th century is normally conceived, the moment of the Sagan invasions, everything terrible. Europe was rising still, and it was paradoxically doing it, especially in the case of the context with the Muslim world, through the Muslim world as well. It's incredible. That's the reason why there are so many fronts, actually forgotten fronts of the say Christian-Muslim wars in this period that are dramatically overlooked in order to understand the Crusades. Crusades are usually conceived stereotypically as this bunch of essentially French and German, prevalently French, Belgian nobility that takes some ships, goes there, founds this principate, this kingdom and principates in the Near East. But we don't see what was far beyond that, what the Byzantines had partly been involved with for centuries, was the Italian maritime republics had been doing now extremely fast, and that's only thanks to them that, for example, the Crusader states could ever exist in terms of logistical connection of maritime traffics and communications, etc. What had happened in the Iberian Peninsula since basically, the Muslims had arrived there and conquered almost all the thing, but they're in the north, in those mountainous areas of the Asturias, etc. The taking the cross was something really meaningful, very deeply imbued, and that in the Reconquista will remain very, very strongly, and even as a defining factor of an entire people, as identitarily speaking, etc. Besides all the intersections, so the idea that given these premises, and we will see now, we will add more to this. The idea that in 1095, 96, eventually, especially, there was this major expedition that comes to accomplish something pretty amazing, by the way, strategically speaking, tells you that you have to stress the continuity with what had happened before, right? You can't look at this. The first crusade, for example, was an extremely orderly and perfectly planned, and logistically organized more than else, expedition. Right. What do you think that Godfrey of Bouillon could know about Syria, about Palestine? I mean, these guys arrived there and they're able to conquer, to defeat, to create some kingdoms. These guys had something to support them. It wasn't mere luck. There are ways to naturally understand in every military situation that obviously the first crusade, that was effectively the only successful one, was partly lucky. It is true, but there is no military expedition that succeeds without luck, by definition. But it's not just luck, right? There has to be something beyond that. And the myth that this was basically just, a bunch of primitive, violent fighters would know. It's a pretty that did this simply because they were lucky, or they it was all about brutality. Well, no, this is not a serious historical assessment. There is far beyond that, and we will see now more in detail partly of this. Talking about pilgrimages once again, and since we have spoken about the Reconquista that was raging at this time already, there is this great destination, that one of the most ancient ones, the one of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. This location was developed basically because of the cult of Saint James Major, whose burial was thought to be identified in a tomb that was found, in fact, there in Galicia, basically, at the beginnings of the 9th century. This is not a case. I mean, that was an area where it was involved in the Reconquista, in which this symbolism was instrumental to the strengthening of the faith in continuity with with what the political and military goals were at the time. These guys weren't conceiving, for example, themselves as, heirs of the ancient Visigothic kingdom or something. They were primarily defining themselves as Christians, right? Because the enemy from the other side was this sea tide of Muslims, right? And that's the conception. That's the even, I don't know how defined it. At least at an ideal level, this, I can't say extremist, but let's say something that really persistent, resilient, that brings this guy to really fuel and to feed the ideal of the Reconquista throughout the generations, and in the construction of the Christian Iberian monarchies. So in that case, for example, the saints cult was conjugated, in fact, since the very beginning, with the religious instances that animated the clash against Islam, and all the Reconquista in here is probably very undervaluated, thinking that the Crusades started kind of later, because since some decades before the Crusades properly met, basically the whole Western Christendom was formally called already already by the Pope Alexander II with the concession of the indulgence to the for all those who would have taken the arms against the Moors. That this was the term in which they were called the Muslims in the sources. This happens in 1064. We're talking about 30 years before, more than 30 years before the First Crusade. How would you want to define that? It's important, really, because it is true that Spain, for example, was a kind of thing on its own. I mean, Spain was heavily, for example, Francized in part. Even you can see it in the military equipments and all this stuff. But it was still a very, very different perspective from, let's say, France, Germany, partly even of Italy, in the sense that, you know, the Carolingian Europe had made a difference objectively. I mean, the real main connections, the Iberian Peninsula was fairly disconnected, partly because they had been cut off by the same Muslims, right? So I'm just guessing this because I'm trying to really look at the, you know, at the causes that kind of might have made this context kind of redimensioned, or at least overlooked when thinking about the beginnings of the Crusades proper. But here you have the Pope giving the indulgence to everybody who joins against the Moors in Spain. And by the way, it's plenty of Western Europeans that go fight into Spain. At this time, Spain was full of French and German knights. On the Aragonese, the Mediterranean front, there was the Genoese and Pisan fleets that were supporting heavily the Reconquista against the Muslims, you know, and therefore there was already a very strong commitment in many ways that in part was autonomous, let's be honest, because everywhere there is war, especially in land in that context, there are mercenaries who come from other countries, right? So it's perfectly normal. At the same time, you find also these other, for example, the Italian city-states that start fighting and sweeping the whole Western Mediterranean from Saracen piracy in a very few time, like in 1 century, right? So this is seriously important, because you see that there was already a massive effort from Western Christendom in this previous phase than the Crusades, before the Crusades started, right? So it's interesting also about the Moors. The Moors were the Mauri in the Latin, language. It was a synecdoche that, you know, people think that the Moors were an actual people. The Moors were not an actual people. It was a term that was used specifically, at least it was used obviously not in a non-specific way, but it was part of these populations from especially the Western North Africa, and in Spain, that, you know, that basically from the Atlas Mountains, etc. Also Spain, in this phase of crumbling of the Cordoba Caliphate, has these waves of Moroccans chiefly that form the Almohads and Almoravid dynasties, that every once in a while they re-inject this Berber elements into the and even beyond, even from Black Africa actually into Spain, and they partly fuel definitely the resistance to the Reconquista, right? And that's even though they kind of also are not so long lived, and actually there is a very big difference between the Caliphate of Cordoba and these other dynasties. You know, like from the 11th century, all these taifas, these smaller kingdoms, the Caliphate had disintegrated. And that's also why the Christians partly managed to press hard at that point and to gain the upper hand in the system. In fact, the Reconquista actually lasted so long. The moment of greater effort kind of stopped into the 13th century. After that, basically, Christian European monarchies, the Christian Iberian monarchies, they start fighting each other rather than the Muslims were. But they have accomplished most of it at the end of the day. And then there are other things that complicate the scenario that basically made the situation stall until the end of the 15th century. But it's interesting that the Christian European effort is already Western European effort is directed towards the Muslims already in that scenario. Excuse me, drink a little once again. So you realize that by the end of the 11th century, everything was already predisposed so that similar enterprises to the Iberian one could be achieved. Naturally, with a different objective at the end of the day, but still based on the same concepts. Because this is a matter of concepts at the end of the day. You can make a quantitative case for that, and definitely the Crusades were a big thing, but they were in continuity with this, so they cannot be categorized as something fundamentally different from what already existed from this point of view. So, as we know, passing a bit to, for example, the Council of Clermont, right, in 1095, to the First Crusade. So in November 1095, there is this Council of Clermont that is called for other ecclesiastical matters, and it's here which basically Pope Urban II, by condemning the clashes between the Christians that covered in blood Western Europe, he vehemently exhorted all those who were involved into this stuff. First of all, many knights that chiefly were part of the combating elements, to take the road for the Holy Land in order to clean us, to clean themselves from the guilt, from their sins, and to contribute to keep the infidels far from the places and the life of Christ, the places of the life of Christ. So this was an invitation to pilgrimage once again, right? And not properly the announcements of or the call of a crusade. This is something that it's difficult. What is a crusade? What are you talking about? People assume that 1095, 1095 is really one of those dates that, have an importance, as always. It's like the Battle of Poitiers, 732. It's like, there are these key dates. But when you look at the historiographical dimension that they assumed, you realize that, if you look at the sources straight, what really happened during the Clermont Council? I mean, was this radical call now just unleash, go to fight against the infidels, like that had never happened? There had never been a call for that. We've just seen that it had happened. And therefore, when we think, oh, well, the First Crusade was called, well, the Council of Clermont, the term crusade was unknown. Nobody ever pronounced it. Crusade is a name that appears at the earliest the 13th century. So we're talking about now almost the end of the Crusades, basically, end of the same Christian dominions of Outre-mer in the Near East. The crusade, the term crusade is pretty, easy to understand. I mean, it's about the symbol of the cross that was depicted on the armor, on the surcoats, on the flags, and so on. Which was normal as well to have. I mean, throughout the whole Christian history, every Christian army, as well as any Muslim army, has always, I mean, literally always, displayed symbols of their own religion, like every single other people out there. I mean, this idea that, I don't know, it's about monotheism, no, it's not. I mean, the whole ancient world used religious symbols everywhere in their armies. Also in here, who took the cross? It was normal for a Christian to fight for the cross. There is no watershed with the Crusades. It's a myth, historiographically speaking, if there has ever been even such a specific, specification, right? So, and how do you understand this? Well, it's actually pretty easy. The Crusades, after see, the term appears in the 13th century. So it's obvious that at this time, as we all know, it's plenty of sources that talk about the Crusades that have happened, right? So there are chronicles written several years later, the Council of Clermont, and the speech of the Pope on this occasion that is narrated by these sources actually might have been partly reworked. I mean, I'm not saying at Clermont Urban II never claimed anything like let's organize this, but it surely did it in terms that really do not match perfectly with what the ideology of the Crusade has developed in the following centuries. And this is also very important, very, very important, because at the end of the day, we still live partly when we study the Crusades, within the myth, even expressed in a good sense. I mean, not just like a lie. There's no conspiracy here, but it's something that was written much later. It's not that we know this freaking much about the 11th century in the first place, in any kind of context. Do you think in the history is the 11th century doesn't produce an enormous amount of sources. It's often very, very scanty, very. It's impossible most of the times to know what to even get a refined historiographical criticism and interpretation of contemporary sources. I mean, everything is still very yet to develop in the way we're used to from a modern mind. So aside from this note, that I think it's important because how many times did the concept Deus vult, for example, is the thing as if all these representations of Urban II calling for the Crusade at Clermont, all the might have not happened in that way. Absolutely, we can't even be fairly sure about it. But in order to understand, therefore, the reasons that might have and did, in measure and another, definitely pushed towards the enterprise of the Crusade, we have to take into consideration much, much, much else, right? And that's why today we can't fully talk about it. But just be aware, make ourselves aware that there is more, and that we can't just trigger this. Like the Pope called the Crusade, everybody went there. Yeah, that's not how the Crusades happened overall, right? You have to broaden the scale of all this in order to get the concrete perspective. So, as we know, and as we said before, Europe at the end of the 11th century was living for many ways a phase of strong expansion, right? And this expansion is to be understood not just spatially, which definitely was happening as well, but also, let's say, not in the boundaries of Europe only. I mean, it was mostly something occurring within the same continent, right? Think about even what Europe was in the 11th century. Large areas were still heavily forested, not really healthy, with swamps, etc. Feudalism starts quite strongly with an immense strength, I must say, to carve this spaces for new communities, for this demographic expansion. That there is no real seemingly progress into this. It's not that there is a real technological development or improvement. It's simply that people kept growing, and they lacked enough arable land to feed themselves. So there is a very strong bloody struggle in order to achieve this. It's not a happy, prosper vision of the world. Naturally, through art, through culture broadly, we get that, there is also an improvement. There is the idea of a more of a benevolent God, for example, developing rather than just the punisher. There is much more attention for the New Testament and towards the Old Testament. Many changes you can see in Romanesque architecture passing to Gothic eventually, or at least this proto-Gothic that starts. It's also that it didn't happen from a day to another. There were several developments. Agriculture needed these new surfaces and this put into motion lots of new goods, resources. Trade by land and by sea were reaching ever far markets. We're talking about a transcontinental scale, and therefore Europeans were expanding fast their own horizons. That's why you cannot conceive the Crusades like the moment in which the Europeans discovered that there was this Eastern world. That's a pretty narrow and fundamentally wrong, actually, a vision of medieval Europe. Europe was perfectly aware that there was something else, which doesn't mean that the average guy, in a French village, northern France, knew that, something about, as we were saying before, about Palestine. But the whole system, the elites, those who were involved into this trade, who made these deals, we had this broader political understanding. They knew. There were diplomatic contacts. There was an idea that the world was pretty interconnected. And people traveled. Remember always this. People traveled a freaking lot. Not many people traveled, but those who did it in a way that we would say today, wow, it's amazing. Something we never tried, even just for the risk, as we have seen, of the means of communications of the time was amazing, right? And people knew. Never think that, the French king, let's assume, didn't know that there was, Fatimid held Egypt. Obviously, they knew it. They probably had very sporadic diplomatic relations. There was definitely a general. There was not this massive interest in knowing the other, deepening. But here, the boundaries are expanding. The interests are increasing, and they are increasing towards that direction, right? And it's mutual in many ways. So that what was happening from the other side in the Muslim world is that this awareness was starting, right? And I suspect actually that probably the Western world was already possibly more aware of the East than vice versa, actually, because the Muslims didn't take an awful lot of interest in beyond the Mediterranean, right? It's not that the Muslims looked at, let's say, Central Europe more very in depth, right? Mostly they had this, they had done it, of course. They went up to the Arctic pole. They had seen the Vikings that went, that there were these episodes, but probably Europe at this time was already more sensitive. You can use the adjective sensitive. It was more open to certain ideas, and this is partly due to the absence, to being, in fact, a more primitive culture. And I'm not saying primitive in this sense, like more backwards necessarily or less developed, but having emerged from a world that had less cultural resistance than, say, the Muslims had done, because the Muslims had basically placed themselves into the place of other great empires, of other great imperialistic traditions, etc. Europe was something extremely different. It was already used to relativize certain aspects. The fact it was an empire, for example, but it didn't quite work the way it did, and there were other relations. This is particularly important. The Muslim world is perhaps even more complex by certain standards. In terms of political fragmentations, things are working pretty fast towards that direction. But let's say that they are more they have a greater cultural resistance because they stick to, let's say, a more defined and unchangeable model. The Europeans have not had it before. They have something. They remember the Roman Empire. They remember certain local traditions, but they don't have still the big building that is capable of offering cultural resistance. So they're like a sponge, right? They absorb a freaking lot, and they do it very fast, and they know how to make a synthesis out of that. And this is also partly what the Crusades are about, because what the Christians made at that point was absolutely exceptional. It was. You don't find actually some other episodes like that. Of course, the Muslim world in its own regard had certain similar dynamics, but never quite, especially in this kind of level of political fragmentation context. This cooperation all together to make those expeditions and to rely on them and to use them even to expand to the benefit of the system. So it's important to understand this side of the story as well. So in a situation of this type, you understand it was not difficult to observe in the most varied social contexts I would say the psychological as well as material disposability to undertake new, say, to start new paths of life. There is this other great component of the equation, that is the cadet sons of the great aristocratic families, of the aristocratic families broadly meant, that are in an ever greater number excluded by succession of the paternal goods to the benefit of the firstborn sons, right? This is happening because feudalism is spreading fast, and feudalism is building much greater assets. So let's say the heritage in inheritance system and the matrimonial policies become increasingly more codified and aimed at maintaining the bulk of the paternal lines, property and assets into the hands of one person, generation by generation, without splitting that. In Europe before this, there was, both in the Roman and in the Germanic tradition, the equal split of the father's inheritance among all the male sons, partly also of the women, especially in the Roman case, at least at one point. Naturally, we're talking about very ancient times, but let's say this aristocratic system had basically now concentrated the resources, the assets, into the hands of smaller people. This is a broader tendency of feudalism proper in general, also socially speaking. So there are more means to achieve this, and one of the consequences at every level, because actually the feudal system worked at all levels basically in the same way, from the emperor to the little baron. All these other second, third, etc. Born sons were to take another path. Many of them, also for the sake of patrimonial strategies, took the ecclesiastical path, because at this point the feudal system invests a lot in the foundation of private chapels and monasteries, etc., because they enjoy ecclesiastical immunity, and as long as the various abbots, etc., are part of the same family, it's like one of the soundest assets ever. So some of the male sons do that, and it's fascinating because it happened in history, and even up to relatively recent in times in the Ancien Régime, that maybe, I don't know, as it often happened because of those times, life conditions, the first born son died. So that maybe that they had to call the brother who had already started their religious life and then came back into the century, let's say, into the seculum, and would behave like like they did, and the layman. And being a lay aristocrat this time means exclusively one thing: war. And there is nothing else. Like the prototype of these young men was essentially, they were fighters, right? And they were warriors also, but they were starting to evolve from that. Just it was a feudalism and the development of cavalry. I made several videos about this. If you go in medieval knighthood playlists, you can find that. Cavalry is something you have to be able to do collectively. This is not just the ancient chieftain who fights just for his own pride and thing. These aristocrats are extremely arrogant and violent and presumptuous and bullying and they're, but they still hold that, and they feel it. They have this even kind of proto-racial pride that they are kind of noblemen. They're different even physically from the rest of the population. But they also start to evolve. Like medieval warfare starts to get more collective, right? And cavalry at this point is really rising fast, heavy cavalry, and the effectiveness of heavy cavalry is on the base of collective training, right? 80 scattered knights are not as strong as the same 80 scattered knights, but in information. And basically the entire life of these people that was spent on horseback constantly during the good season was basically training over and over and over and over and over and over again for their entire lives. There were knights that were even 80 years old. They did always the same thing they had been doing since they were 16, 14 and whatever. To train for war and exclusively from war. And to train for war means essentially that there was no distinction between peacetime and wartime, chiefly because war existed at the same time, but secondly because even when there wasn't, people trained in tournaments. Now tournaments during the 11th century, you think, when people think about tournaments, they think about the 14th century Italian joust with like the defense in the middle, all this kind of thing. Erase this from your mind. In 11th century tournaments were not metaphorically, I mean literally the same identical thing of war, like including dead people. So this happened. This was just an excuse. Sometimes when they chose the battleground was just places with vineyards, etc. They could pillage and sack just like in real war, as you imagine, to the extent of the local communities. But at this point, that's where, as far as feudal elite has been, has gone in terms of social stratification and relegation and emargination of this lower strata of the population. And all they do is to fight, and they love this. They're all about war. They're illiterate. They don't do anything, but they fight in a way that even when the Byzantines and the Muslims that didn't like the Frankish knights at all, because they thought they were a bunch of barbarians essentially, but they all got to admit that when they mounted on horseback and they made those charges all together, the Western knights, those were like the toughest bread you could ever find. This is something that goes back actually far in time. This is something the Byzantines were observing since the era of the migration era about this Germanic peoples, and they had this very they had in their blood this warlike character, of course metaphorically speaking, and it's all very and as you understand, this society is all but very peaceful, right? The church is upset about this. There are the pieces of God and the truces of God. This way to say, okay, you don't, at least if you have to pillage and to do this all the time, don't do it in the ecclesiastical properties. And let's do that on Sunday, that is God's day. Let's avoid bloodshed, etc. So there is a problem here. This was Europe that was constantly in war. When you think that. I've heard some ridiculous perspectives of people who evidently don't really like to open up books in the first place, they think that, I don't know, Christian Europe was kind of pacific within itself, and violence was justly directed just against the Muslims. Um, this was a society where violence was a normal element of political dialectics. I mean, any person who has read about this world and there is no difference with the rest of the world. So don't think offended because I say, oh, I'm European too, and I don't give a damn about this. That these guys were doing the worst things, butchering children, burning churches, destroying. This is all things you find in the laws, you find in the trials, you find in the accusations, you find in the chronicles. That was the world. And it's obvious. It's obvious. There is no central authority. How do you think the thing could be managed otherwise? But at the same time, you should be able to understand that this form of violence kind of is normal in a mobster society, because this is a mobster society. Just remember that in the absence of a centralized power, you can't say that this is like the mob. This is literally the mob proper. This is how the ancien regime has worked. Always, there is no difference between protection, and tributes, and hush money and stuff like that. It's literally the same exact thing, and this starts from the top, because the king is just basically the bigger boss of the situation, and you have this, and it's continuous violence. But at the same time, there is also a positive element of the story, meaning that this is not this. You see, when I say these things, it automatically, I know that for lots of people, this equates immediately to say, oh, well, you're making a positive or negative criticism of this. No. I'm telling you how this really worked. And this couldn't work in a different way, because in the absence of a centralized power, this is the best way a society can work. So this feudal system, as brutal and violent and bloody as it could be, it still worked. I mean, if you look at the policies of the local lords, what they were trying to do, even through violence, at the end of the day, what they were trying to do was just to expand their power and to, in the process, pacify what was within their domains. And this is what everybody was trying to do, what the great feudal monarchies. I made a video about this and explaining how it literally, it couldn't really work in other ways. These were clientelary societies. They needed to work like this. So when you say that 11th century Europe was a bloody mess, you're not making a moral judgment of them. You're actually depicting, making an accurate depiction of what that was really like. And we know it from a massive amount of evidence. And this is not a matter of opinion. This is not something you can go around there and claim, well, no, they didn't kill each other because they were kind of good, they did it only against the infidels. No, it doesn't work like that, because it doesn't work like that anywhere in the world, including Europe. This is not Europe more or less than other people. We are all humans. We all behave in that way. It's perfectly normal. As horrifying as it can be. This is the truth. And we know it, because in certain contexts where you can isolate these behaviors, we know that it happens like that. So nothing strange about it. And I would say that in terms of spiritual tensions, etc., this explains actually a lot about this Christian morality, in this sense of, expiating crimes and guilts and sins, and needing to find ourselves. Do you realize what it could be, the psyche of a 12th century Christian knight? I mean, do you realize what those guys actually went through since their childhood? Just like imagine being taken away from your mother, 70 years old, then brought in the household of a stranger, usually your father's friend or lord or whatever, live together with a bunch of other kids who bully each other continuously, and they toughen themselves up. There's also kind of violence, abuse, and stuff like that. and they start using weapons pretty soon, and they start being fueled with a sense of aristocratic prestige, and saying, I'm the toughest one, I'm a rougher one, and then starting going to war, like a squire in the retinue of the higher lord, that you had to obey to everything. You had to run, otherwise it would beat you, and it would tell you you were nothing. You had to live through those perils. And then the more you aged, the more you even started, to cut someone's throat, and to rape someone, to kill, and to do that during your ravagings and so on. And then you would be dubbed knight. It was quite of a, it was a ritual, passage, a ritual in many ways. This is something, knight's dubbing is something that goes back into tribal societies with this pain rituals of passage. That people were exposed to physical sufferance, moral pressure, and all this stuff. That was the toughest thing, and it was done not because people were evil, but because, and although they had not rationalized it, they did it because in order to fight in that world, you had to be that tough. And it doesn't matter that you basically were messed up psychologically for the rest of your life, because the rest of your life was, if you were lucky, like 30 years old in war. Of course, if, average person, if they passed childhood, they had a substantial, good chance to live up to their 60s, their 70s. But a knight's life was, you knew you could die from a moment to another, and most of the deaths wouldn't even occur like, beheaded by an enemy knight. Also, because if we got a coat of mail, it's dramatically difficult to cut someone's head, or almost impossible practically. But you would die like in a stinky ditch, with a wound that would infect, and it wouldn't be healed, and dying within your own blood and guts, and flies all over you while you were smelling the putrefaction of your wound. Like that. That's the life you had, and this was under everybody's eyes continuously. So this was just think to psychoanalyze a person like that, to realize what it means. That was the reality. It was freaking, I don't even know how to define it, actually, but you can't understand what it meant. And the reason why they had to be so tough is that they were to butcher down people in a blink of an eye. And they did it. And they were the damn best machine ever created at that point, in terms of individual training. Because in terms of individual training, feudal knights are literally the most professional elite you can ever find in a military context, and at that time in history. And that's why armies like the one of the Byzantines and the one of the Muslims, that were freaking developed militaries at those times, looked upon these guys like a bunch of nuts, basically, but that when they charged, they were basically unstoppable, right? And so just thinking to this context, also what the spiritual, and these guys, I mean, there were people that when they were sung the stories of, of knights in this chivalric literature, that was in fact all aimed to idealize all of this, because they knew that reality was something incredibly, brutal, right? And they were told about these princesses, this beautiful young, and these people who were able to cut, children to pieces, would go, would lose it, would go in tears, thinking about their young sisters, maybe that they were made, nuns, etc. Their mothers, and that had surely died in some other, birth because of infections and all these things that happen. And this lost innocence that they had once had, and that also the Christian, the Christian religion was whispering to them, like, repent yourself, be proud, do it for a good reason. So it was a tough life. It was something that could degenerate from this kind of a radical extreme violence to this, childish sentimentalism that emerges actually very clearly from the sources. And you wonder, what the hell? I mean, these were really strange, and much of that society was like this actually, because the same level of brutality actually fell on the heads of everyone in a way or another. This was very militarized societies. They saw violence all the time. There was no justice. Basically, justice was a major concern at the time, exactly because it was difficult to find. And actually, the feudal system helped progressively to try to find this order, right? So this is a world that evolves very slowly, but there is a civilization process in the meanwhile. I mean, as brutal as it can be, I don't know if this description was really necessary, but it's still civilization passes through this, because you don't put a human being through this stuff and pretend that it doesn't react to do something for the best. And even the Crusades, in all their obscure sites, etc., but they do make civilization. Europe does in industry itself. Let's say it really. It really proves its resourcefulness in many ways. It puts to the test lots of itself, and it's difficult. It's difficult because this is a society that works, that is not that doesn't have a unique direction. So it's very difficult to organize all this. But that's the effort ultimately that will make things change, and we owe to these people partly the way we are now, because our civilization rests on the sufferings of these people, and you never have to forget this, never, because you have no idea how lucky you are in the way you are. Hopefully, at least something serious didn't really happen to you, but in general, I mean, the average person today has really nothing but to thank to have not been born in a time like that. But at the same time, has to recognize that human nature is always dual. That there is always a good and an evil at the same time, and that's what also the church was whispering, And the church has always been so. Like, the church was doing its own private affairs, but at the same time was making civilization, and it did it. Sorry, using hell in context describing the church positively, but I really want to be to emphasize this, because. It's like at the beginning what we were telling about the history of the Crusades. Like, you can't take it just all the bad or all the good and just make an extremization of the thing. You have to be able to think it through, to reason through it, and it's pretty damn difficult, right? It's intuitive, counter-instinctual in some ways. So the knights that we have already defined, they were living of aspiration, of ambition. What we didn't say about this is that in this military environment, this milites, when I say milites, I refer, it's the universal Latin word for, at least for the Middle Ages, for defining medieval knights, right? For defining knights, and what I forgot to say was there was a brutal competition between each other, because the reason is they are part of of lineages that are in constant competition with each other, right? So that there is a lot of exchange. I mean, we have seen that at this point in history, this has developed really like a class that feels itself distinguished from the others. They think like to be the masters of the world. They think they are the most important people. And the others are not even comparable. They have definitely a lot of difficulty to understand even clergyman's life, etc. But at the same time, and there are intersections, as we've seen, also because all the major abbots and bishops come from these military families at the end of the day, and that also explains where some of bishops are so warlike, and they fight just like any other knight, because there was no real prescription against it, at least in some ways, and they are terribly competitive, though. These lineages are struggling to the top within the kingdom of the various vassals in phase of the king. So they're they all want to prove that they are the toughest ones. They are fanatically courageous and tough, and they don't take any insult. They hate each other's guts. That's part of the pressure that they're posed under, actually. Probably even the toughest one at the end of the day, more than, killing someone, trying to be killed, but really having this constant threat on their family, on their assets, and their properties, because war is the way that is taken away very easily. But at the same time, they're pretty damn, especially these cadets that have nothing to lose because they haven't inherited anything. They have only their military skill. So what they do is that they fight it through. I mean, the best way to make it to the top, and maybe to receive a fief as for the services that have rendered to this vassal, to the king, etc., is to fight, is to distinguish themselves in action. And in their ambition, they're definitely driven by thirst of riches. I mean, they really want money. They really want, money starts circulating now, but chiefly they want castles, they want titles, they want fiefs, they want to fit in, right? Like American style. I want to fit in. And it was the idea. And it was a real problem because these were all doing it at the same time. Like, it wasn't one guy every once in a while. This was a class that was, self reproducing itself at every generation, and there was a lot of esprit de corps in the thing. There was, even within the same knights, there was a sort of social segmentation. There were naturally the grizzled veteran was on average a better, even equipped and wealthier person that had already, made a very big thing was making the right marriage. Like the really at an economical level, these knights were always seeking for the best woman to marry, to have the best dowry, and to that was much of how they actually settled down, still continuing to fight, but hopefully starting now maybe another lineage on its own, and everything was intertwined with the family of origin, with this other. So you can imagine the mess that really was at the end of the day. So usually also, well, this is maybe not necessary, but just imagine it, they usually married very young women. They were already pretty old, relatively old at least, and also because women, at 12 years old, they, usually they lived a few, so that they wanted to make as many children as they could, also for the sake of the male, lineage. So, children died dramatically easily at this point. So. And women for birth, for carriage as well. So there was this strong emphasis even on reproduction and etc. And it was tough also because this man also went all the good season out. So it was a rough world, right? It was definitely very different from the one we live in, but also very different from sometimes the chivalrous picture that we have in mind, that was trying to mitigate reality, let's say, to put a decent cover on how all the things that happen. But the system kind of worked at the same time. We don't even have to depict it in such a dramatic tones. I mean, it was violent, yes, it was brutal, yes, but it still was functional to something, to progress at the end of the day. And when especially these very young knights, etc., they had their relatively short life ahead, they were definitely thrilled at the idea of, let's say, going onto this journey to do something definitely that they were trained to do, that it was to fight, but also with a moral mandate, like with a promise to be forgiven because of their sins, and to have their sins forgiven, and to leave, to have a sort of an investment into afterlife, as we were saying before. That was considered a bit not very differently from like a patrimonial asset at that time, right? And they would invest a lot of resources in that process, and naturally dying in an enterprise was at least the assurance that they would earn their place in heaven. So as you know, this was insane, like in the Muslim world as well. if not even more pronounced. But it's really also this dreamlike world, this exotic world of the East that at the time was already there, like, because this myth of, the exotic Orient is not really a modern colonialist picture. It's something that was imagined and dreamed since the ancient times. This terribly fertile lands of the spices of precious stones that which allegedly places like India and the Far East and other mysterious lands for the Europeans would abundant of, right? So this was a sufficient reason also for many to join a crusade, right? Especially given that, and this is particularly important to remember, the trade routes with the East were already open. I mean, the same people who were fighting essentially against the Muslims were the same ones that were trading with them. Europeans did it. I mean, take the Italian maritime republics. Those people normally traded with Muslims as much as they fought with them. And they were the same guys who brought physically, and even ever more importantly, the Crusader armies into the East to fight the Saracens, but at the same time trading with them. And the same happened in the Crusader states. Crusader states traded all the time with the Muslims, and then they fought against them. Also because wars were kind of continuous in this sense, but aside from their seasonal dimension, there was this need of recovering resources that were very, very difficult to store, to produce, to maintain actually in terms of surplus, because crop rate was what it was. The economy was barely above the level of survival rate, and then in terms of production, and therefore everything needed also this continuous relation. And this means that Europeans largely knew that the East abounded of that wealth, right? It was known. There weren't just voices. There were people in Europe that actually went there habitually at this point. And even in Muslim lands, right? So there is nothing, you don't have to think, you went into Muslim lands and you were Christian, you were butchered down. It didn't happen like that. It didn't happen like that. Also because local Muslim authorities had all to lose from stopping trade with the Christian world, and vice versa. So they would do that maybe when they were at war, or maybe they by the way, they did it usually against the merchants to seize their stuff. But it's not that they started butcher literally everyone. It happened sometimes. Even the Christians, when they took Jerusalem, they massacred the same Christians and Jews that lived in theirs. It's not that it's normal in its excess sometimes, but it was considered an excess also at the time. Let's be honest, because as violent as this world could be, really, like, violence was usually motivated. This is also very important to understand, that when we look at these bloodbaths, and also there are those pacifists who have today, these guys killing always each other, killing each other for the sake of religion, or your book or my book. Well, this is not a realistic, and correct historical interpretation either. First of all, they didn't do it because of their books. Nor because of religion as a whole. They did it for, seizing profitable assets, like all populations in the world have always done. Then if you want to legitimize that with religion, well, you can do it literally with everything else, and everybody has always done the same exact thing ever. And we keep doing it all the time. I mean, not with religion, maybe with something else, but it's always the same story. We need that. We function like that, like societies. The Crusades have nothing special in this sense about this cause, but you have to learn to respect these people, in the sense that as brutal and individually reckless as they could be, that they were still framed into a hierarchy that made pretty rational choices, and even the use of violence was related to that. It was functional to these choices, and you don't have to take it like just for the sake of killing people, because it's pretty pretty naive to believe this. And it's a failure to understand, like, or even to put yourself into the condition to understand these things that are way deeper than that. You can't give an explanation like that. That's like what an average 14 years old can arrive to, like, without excessive problems. Let's say you can't do better than that. So let's say that this myth of the Orient was attractive already, right? It was thought that, and it wasn't just about the material wealth, it was naturally also about the pride, about the name of the family. Having a relative that had died in the Crusade was a great honor, right? There are many families in Europe that remember this thing, having participated in the Crusades. It was a nobilitating factor. It was a matter of prestige, right? And naturally, those who came back probably, maybe some of them hadn't accomplished a good much, but in general, at least, the first waves had managed to conquer all of these lands. I mean, there was something about it that worked, right? And at the end of the day, they were paid. Like, these guys weren't really fighting for nothing, just for a promise. They were still mercenaries. They were still military men. But however, never exclude, even for these motives, the religious and penitential tension that pushed these people. Never do it. Do not think it's the hypocrisy or saying things like, religion didn't exist at all. They were doing it just for money. They were doing it primarily for money, but they were doing it too for this other stuff. Okay, maybe alone they would have not brought to this to happen, but they were important because these people were raised into that mindset, and there wasn't also much you could do for changing it at the end of the day. It was normal to reason like that because everybody did it. Society was shaped in that way. People were taught those things. It was normal. They corresponded. It had a logic, right? It made sense. It was functional to that type of society. Religions are not adopted because someone imposes them for no reason. There are certain contexts that produce the need for having that religion and eventually to spread it, maybe even to impose it, but you can't really play with that too long if the society mismatches in terms of intellectual development that mindset, that understanding, that mentality. Religion has always changed. Today's Christians are obviously not the Christians of 1000 AD nor 500 AD. There are different factors that intervene to mold someone's mind. Never think that these weren't complex minds. They were very complex. I mean, they were relatively uncomplicated, perhaps, but there were still lots of factors interacting into it at best, right? And read medieval literature from the 11th century, from the 12th century, and look. Those who wrote certain things, they were smart. That were people who definitely knew what being smart really meant, right? So, since we touched now the military aspect of the story, there is also further chapter to read that I'm saying I'm pleased to see it's being received, at least in those environments of people that get interested into these stories, and it has to do with the relations between not much between the Westerners and the Muslims, but between the Westerners and the Byzantines. Forgive the approximation, of course you can't consider Byzantium perfectly Western, there's no problem. I'm just making case Western European or the Franks as other approximation, but let's say that there is this narrative that is becoming fairly widespread and, taken as a major reason now of the Crusades, at least formally. That is the weight that in the realization of the Crusades had, for example, the call towards the Western Christians from the Emperor Alexius Comnenus to the Byzantine Empire, to convince them to take arms against the Seljuk Turks, and or let's say the situation of alarm that was created by the fall of Jerusalem into the hands of the Turks, and by the ensuing oppressions that were let's say vexation, I don't know how to say this, violences that were inflicted to the pilgrims, right? Now, this is the general picture, right? The Turks are bullying the pilgrims, and the Byzantines have been defeated at Manzikert, and they're asking for help. And therefore, the West answers to the call. Now, this is fair, okay? These are things that happen, but they have to be a bit contextualized. First of all, in terms of the violence, let's say towards the pilgrims, let's say that the danger constituted by the Turks that at this point especially had taken away a great part of Anatolia from the Byzantine Empire, was really, especially towards the 90s of the 11th century, was fundamentally coming apart in some ways, because the Seljuk Empire was fragmenting, politically speaking. When you think about the Seljuk Empire, these were big empires that were usually rooted, based better into a certain major regional powers, like in this case Persia, with certain elements that are fueled, continuously from the steppes, etc. But these are not centralized empires. They have a huge influence and even ability of projection, but that's also relative. The Muslim world is dramatically fragmented from a political point of view, and the Seljuks now are fragmenting even more. So, for example, way more imposant for the Byzantines as a threat at this point was the Norman problem, like the Siculo-Norman kingdom in southern Italy that had launched now invasions against Epirus in the 12th century. The Normans will even be able to seize Thessalonica. It was the second city of the empire. And generally speaking, in fact, the Byzantines didn't like the Westerners at all very much. But and this is what the Byzantine call was really about. Absolutely, the Byzantines didn't have, first of all, probably they didn't even expect, to be honest, something like a crusade. In any case, from an ideological point of view, it was something completely extraneous to their mindset. Like, in a world where the emperor is the head of the church, etc., to see that from the West there is a bishop that calls for a crusade, the lay powers of his own, of the Western Empire, let's say we can call it in this way, to make a military expedition was something incredible. What Alexius Comnenus wanted was definitely mercenaries, and this is very important because I made a pretty hefty video on the Battle of Manzikert, like 3 hours and a half, and you can see there, for example, there was plenty of Western knights into the Byzantine army. I made a video recently about, as we were saying before, about the Western mercenaries Byzantines and Franks into the Seljuk armies themselves. At this point, the Byzantines definitely wanted more mercenaries, and that's what the whole problem was about. But think about this even, at a broader range. Like the Western Knights, before the Crusades, 20, 30, 40 years, even more, were already there. Have you ever thought about this? These were mostly mercenaries. They were chiefly from southern Italy because, the Normans were kind of closer to that. Many joined even the Byzantines, even if the kingdom was against the empire, but still, the political ties were relatively loose even within this kingdom. So you can find them traveling a lot, but they came from everywhere. There were lots of, for example, after Hastings, there were lots of Anglo-Saxons seemingly expatriating, going to fight as mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire. You find definitely French knights, you find German knights, and not just in the Byzantine Empire. You find it basically all over, like we've seen it. You find them in Spain, you find them even in the Balkans in other contexts. So what you realize is that when you think that, I don't know, the Christian knights set foot for the first time in Jerusalem after who knows what, because that was such a faraway foreign land, it's completely false. There was plenty of contractors literally everywhere from Western Europe fighting there from a very long time. I mean, you can't even basically trace where this system came apart. I mean, at this time, naturally, with the increase of monetization, the economical revival, Europe, etc., you find this mercenarism being equally revived, right? But this had basically always happened. Always, right? Think about, I mean, the first guide was the Crusade that sets foot in Palestine. It's a Scandinavian, right? And you know that the Vikings, by the way, had arrived up to the Caspian Sea. They had gone around. I mean, that's why I say always bear in mind that people traveled and did it a lot, right? And even the story of the Seljuks bullying the Christian pilgrims, do you really want to say, well, okay, let's assume it was true? First of all, yeah, there might have been violence, like in the sense, let's imagine, these pilgrims would arrive. The Turks probably did, I mean, the government didn't quite have the same, an interest in really to bully these peoples more than much, not because they feared the Christian reaction, but as we were saying before, because they had economical interests. Now, there is to say that the Seljuks were, like all the new converts, were tendentially more fanatic and zealous than the other Muslims, right? Because that's how it happens. Like, you want to prove that you're better because these were even warriors. I mean, the Seljuk Turks have something very different. They're basically warriors of the steppes, completely Persianized in culture, a bit like the Vikings of the Normans of the situations that came from Scandinavia and got French, basically, de facto. They have a lot to prove, because basically they have taken into hostage the Caliph of Baghdad. They have created this enormous empire, so they feel pretty self-confident, right? And surely there was oppression in the sense that maybe pilgrims were taxed, they had to pay heavier tolls, they could presumably be robbed without many problems, without much intervention from the side of the local authorities to help them in any way. So it's possible that things had got roughened for a while, but what you see actually is that when Jerusalem had taken away from the Arabs and seized by the Turks, the new rulers, they were essentially just exacting money of them. And what happened is, it's pretty much it. I mean, there is no sensible worsening of the situation that justifies actually or motivates in the first place. And justifies is a wrong word, but motivates the Crusades. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, just because pilgrims paid a little more of taxes, I mean, with all the massive things in terms of war, bloodshed, fights, that's all what you think the Western world was concerned about? That's not a real reason. It might have been an excuse or even a valid concern, but that's not what triggered the whole thing. And by the way, I think that these abuses had existed chiefly because you see that the pilgrims at this point organized themselves better. They organized their security better. They start hiring contractors. For example, the same Normans that eventually create the kingdom in southern Italy, they had started in there as contractors for the pilgrims that were directed to Jerusalem. So what basically meant in here is that these guys got escorted with armed men, as it was probably, many pilgrims would be armed, because it was the kind of, I think, average thing you had to do if you wanted to go across Europe and Near East on foot, because it's full of brigands, of robbers, of thieves, and other threats. So these armed retinues probably went into Muslim lands, accompanied the pilgrims, they escorted them and went back, and probably without much of even a clash with the local authorities. So these great violences on the pilgrims are not truly witnessed. We have mostly tolls, right? And this better organization that the pilgrims have. So this means that, if they had been butchered down, they simply would have not gone there. Because you can't go there just with contractors in a foreign country and pretending that you come there alive if the intention of the rulers is to massacre you. So these guys were simply going there. Surely it wasn't an easy journey, it was dangerous. The local authorities were probably not very nice in general, but they were probably not also very interested in, blocking like the pilgrims, pilgrimages from which they made a freaking lot of money in the first place, especially in a center like Jerusalem, that is the holy place for three religions, so that it's been always multi-ethnic. And the Crusaders, when they arrived in 1099 in Jerusalem, I repeat, they massacred Christians and Jews alike, together with the Muslims in there. So also in here, the perspective has to be really massively redimensioned in terms of, the Crusades were triggered by this, by the Byzantine call, by the Seljuk oppression of pilgrims. Really think so? Such a big thing in motion just for this stuff? I mean, I don't want to downsize it. I mean, it's obvious that, for example, after the Battle of Manzikert, even the Westerners saw the near threat that, the Seljuks had posed. But even in there, what the Westerners did at the end of the day was to get across the Byzantine Empire, the Near East, just to go there and take their own kingdoms and principalities, creating them from scratch, and that's pretty much it. And it's not they always had a great sympathy towards the Byzantines, who also were terrified by the arrival of the Crusaders, because they absolutely didn't imagine a whole army to arrive there and even threat Constantinople, which the Crusaders always tried to do, eventually succeeding in 1204. So here, talking about the target is pretty, difficult. Obviously, it's obvious that the Westerners had spotted what the opportunities were in there, and something tells me that if you send an expedition up so far, doesn't matter how these worlds are new and how obviously there was a cultural misunderstanding in part of this local, societies, that the Westerners tried to implant feudalism to make it work, but the local society was very different. It worked on very different bases. But also, in order to launch an expedition in there, you have kind to know the place. The Byzantines kind of knew that, but the Italians also knew it, and probably lots of mercenaries in Western that had been fighting in there, coming back in Western Europe, had told what it was like, and this made them think, okay, let's try to go there and see if we can take something. And this is particularly important because actually, if you really drive, if really you think that the first factor that drove the Crusades is, this wall against, let's say, religions versus religion, but what happens actually very often, and you can measure it even in the West in the same time, is that when there is a political fragmentation, there are always mercenaries around. There are always invaders. There are always bands of warriors that arrive there to seize power. Now, the Crusades are something very different, as we've seen, in terms of these massive expeditions for the time. But even if you look in Spain, how it happened, these were basically bands of Frenchmen, Germans, that went fighting there, like at the service of the local Christian Iberian principalities, just as mercenaries. I mean, when the church
told them to go fight in there. It was like saying, okay, let's take this opportunity since that's an open front and people are being killed there, and it's effectively a struggle against the Muslims. Let's try to get rid of all this, brutal cadets we have in here, these aristocratic families, etc., and let's send them to fight in there. It was really a problem. It's like as if, you had a band of thugs that terrorizes your quarter, and you have the opportunities to send it, I don't know, to make police somewhere else. You in order to get rid of them, you can't find a better excuse to do it. And therefore, at the fragmentation of the Seljuk world, what I see is that probably the Westerners spotted. I don't know how explored this path is historiographically speaking, but they probably explored the opportunity to really to pierce that soft area of Islam. And the interesting stuff about this is that, in fact, the Muslims themselves quite underestimated the Crusaders' threat. This is very interesting. The Mongols, for example, were a total catastrophe for the Islamic world also because they were way more devastating. But the Westerners, not so much. I mean, obviously, the Muslim world in the Near East reacted with arms. It was continued prolonged warfare, but let's say it was so fragmented that most Muslims were just playing on each other in that sense, maybe even siding with the Christians, so they didn't quite perceive, even themselves, this Western infiltration as something dramatically threatening the Muslim world in general. This would have been the case, for example, if the Byzantines had won at Manzikert, and then the Crusades would have perhaps happened at the same time. It would have been very threatening. We could have had even the reconquest of the whole Syria and Mesopotamia, and Islam divided in two chunks, and with maybe the Shia in Persia becoming prevalent in the Muslim world. History could have changed pretty radically in this sense. But the arrival of the Westerners there, and today we try to explain it, was not really favored, but let's say it was motivated, and it was caused by predisposing factors that we have tended to forgotten if we think of the Crusade just as this heroic and dramatically difficult enterprise, in the sense of, let's say, it was dramatically difficult, say something better, let's say something that happened by chance, right? It's one day the Pope woke up and said, okay, launch the Crusade there, they went, and it's odd, and this changed history. Well, there were many predisposing factors, and I feel, at least, that there is no massive attention towards these predisposing factors. The idea that the Christian society was already at war against the Muslim one, that the popes had already launched offensives in this sense with the promise of the indulgences for fighting against the Muslims, that were very strong contacts between especially these areas of Syria and Palestine with Europe proper, and that the let's say the political situation was definitely not such a bad one at that point, specifically in 1095, 1096, to take action against a very fragmented, an ever fragmented Muslim world, right? So these are all important factors. It's not to downsize really what the Crusaders were able to achieve, because from a strictly military, organizational, logistical point of view, that was a hell of an expedition. I mean, the First Crusade. It's really something impressive, and it's the First Crusade. Even in its darkest episodes, it's still a terribly inspiring. If you take the episode, I mean, if you take let's say the ideological, religious, and moral principles of the time, that had really been a big thing, right? That could have been easily defeated, but the fact that it succeeded, it really fueled the the fantasies, the expectations, the ambitions of all these fighters that went, then obviously we don't have time. The history of the Crusades is too complicated, but just to make you understand how there are a few real watersheds in history, and you have to look at always the problem of the origins, the problem of the beginnings, because otherwise it's kind of useless to even try to understand this episode, because if you don't know what happened before, and especially when you see that this is something that has definitely a lot to do with what eventually happened, it can easily be a cause, a direct cause, well, it's not fair, historically speaking. It's not accurate at that point anymore. So I'm not sure of how much expressed myself today. It's a fairly long video, and there is naturally a lot to tell. It's obvious that this is a perspective, right? Exclusively this, and I will come back on these topics. So I leave you with this. I believe it's enough. I don't want to add anything because otherwise I would repeat myself. But in any case, reflect on this. I mean, take it as a perspective. Take it as, especially about the before. That's the important thing. Okay, so I quit it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.